You people should use the back. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were laced with something colder, measured, intentional. Judge Loretta Sinclair barely had time to process them before the hands came, firm, entitled, and completely out of line. They landed on her shoulders and turned her around like she was luggage that had lost its tag. Gasps rippled through the first-class cabin. Several heads turned. One phone tilted upward to record. Loretta, steady as stone, didn't flinch further, but her eyes locked with the man standing before her. Flight attendant Richard Sloan, late 40s. Salt and pepper crew cut, name tag polished, authority unearned. "I am seated in 1A, she said, her voice calm, resonant, practiced. He smirked. "Then I'm sure you can find your way back there." She turned away, not in defeat, but in calculation. She walked slowly, silently, back to her seat. Sat down, straightened her blazer, reached for her phone. Airplane mode off. Warning ignored. She scrolled to a contact saved under DOT Oversight, Direct. Her fingers didn't tremble as she typed, "Activate Protocol S3, immediate review. Hold jet reach allocations. Send." Seat 1A had just declared war. 10 minutes earlier, Flight 2270 from New York to Detroit had felt entirely routine. The scent of citrus cleaner clung to the leather seats. Loretta had boarded with the quiet elegance of a woman who didn't need to prove she belonged. At 70 years old, retired from the federal bench but now serving as a senior advisor to the Department of Transportation, she carried more federal leverage than anyone else on that aircraft. No one knew that. She preferred it that way. As she settled into her seat, she reviewed the keynote she was scheduled to deliver the next morning. The topic, accountability and equity in federal transportation funding. The irony had not yet struck. A man 2 rows back argued with a toddler. The woman across the aisle tapped a Bluetooth keyboard like she was coding NASA's launch sequence. Loretta barely noticed. She was marking a section in the funding ledger, the line detailing $4.2 billion in proposed grants to 9 U.S. airports. 3 of them were operated by a vendor under review, Jet Reach, the same airline she was now flying. She sipped the last of her water and pressed the call button. She waited. Richard Sloan appeared. His expression said he didn't like being summoned. "Yes? May I have a glass of water, please?" "We'll begin beverage service after takeoff." That was all. No eye contact, no courtesy. He walked away. Loretta exhaled through her nose. One of those days. They were airborne 15 minutes later. As the seatbelt sign flicked off, she took out her leather-bound notebook. She began cross-referencing dates of compliance audits with vendor claims. Her mind moved with clinical precision. Then her bladder interrupted the flow. She stood and made her way toward the first-class lavatory. She was 3 steps from the door when Richard stepped directly into her path. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said loudly. "First-class lavatory is for first-class passengers only." She blinked. "Seat 1A. I'll need to see your boarding pass." "It's at my seat. You watched me board and sit. Then feel free to return and retrieve it. Otherwise, restrooms in the back are available." He stepped closer, invading her space. Then he laid hands on her. "The rest, you already know." She sent the message. Then she sat. Outside, clouds slid past the window like nothing had happened. But the system had just been activated. Miles away, in a secure server inside the Department of Transportation, a red alert triggered an automated chain of internal reviews. Contracts flagged, payments held, calls made. Jet Reach would feel the frost of $4.2 billion being yanked mid-flight. And Flight 2270 hadn't even started descending yet. Detroit had always reminded Judge Loretta Sinclair of unfinished symphonies. Grit beneath revival, elegance under repair. It was a city clawing its way back to dignity, and Loretta admired that. Not because she pitied it, but because she understood it. She was born in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1953, 2 blocks from a church that was later bombed in a blast meant to silence voices like hers. Her father, Lieutenant Walter Sinclair, had been one of the original Tuskegee Airmen. When he returned from the war, medals on his chest and grit in his jaw, he was denied service at the very bus station he'd helped defend. But he never stopped wearing his uniform. Dignity, he'd say, isn't how they treat you, it's how you carry the truth about yourself. Loretta had carried that truth all the way to Harvard Law School, where she was one of only 7 black women in her entering class. She remembered walking into lecture halls and feeling eyes slide across her like she was misfiled paperwork. It never broke her, but it built her armor, brick by brick, silence by silence. Now, at 70, she had traded her robe for a sharp navy pantsuit and a position that didn't require a gavel to move policy. As senior policy advisor to the U.S. Department of Transportation, she was one of the few people in the country with unilateral discretion to pause or approve federal infrastructure grants. She had real power, quiet power, and that made people uneasy. They preferred their regulators loud and messy, not composed, not calculating. Loretta smiled slightly as the plane cruised above the clouds. The Jet Reach crew didn't know who she was. They didn't know she'd been slated to deliver the keynote address the following morning at the Midwest Aviation Equity Conference in Detroit, where she would outline the Sinclair Index, a new scoring system for airport vendors that factored in civil rights compliance, customer complaints, and diversity benchmarks. They certainly didn't know she was the one holding the pen over $4.2 billion in modernization funds. Their ignorance wouldn't save them. In Seat 2C, a young executive named Brian Hahn noticed the unusual stiffness between Loretta and the flight attendant. He didn't know the full story yet, but something had shifted in the air. The moment Richard laid hands on the woman in 1A, Brian's instincts kicked in. A quiet wrongness. He had been in boardrooms where racism wore a Rolex and spoke in budget speak. This was more brazen, but no less dangerous. He'd started recording when she returned to her seat. Loretta, meanwhile, was already thinking 5 steps ahead. She didn't know yet how widespread Jet Reach's behavior was, but she knew a pattern when she saw one. Her notebook already had 3 underlined points. Cabin crew failed to verify identity fairly. Use of physical force against verified passenger. Discriminatory language, corroborated by multiple witnesses. She flipped the page, drew a line, wrote a single sentence. If this happens to me, it's happening to people with no voice. Her job wasn't just to be right, it was to be responsible. She opened her secure government app and began drafting a formal notification to DOT Deputy Director Harold Meacham. Subject: preliminary grounds for emergency funding hold. Jet Reach Operating Group. Rationale: violation of passenger rights. Evidence of systemic discrimination by crew member on Flight 2270, requesting immediate compliance audit suspension and facility review for terminals under Jet Reach control. 15 rows behind her, in economy, a quiet woman in her 40s named Nadine Lowe, pediatric nurse, mother of 3, and frequent flyer, had noticed everything. She had seen how Loretta was treated, how the white man in 2B was offered bourbon and a blanket before Wheels Up, while Loretta got water without lemon, and not even that at first. Nadine whispered to her seatmate, an older man in a Motor City ball cap. "Did you see that?" He nodded. "Shameful. That's someone's grandma." Up in the cockpit, Captain Reuben Wells had just received a secure message on his dash. Priority instruction. Deviate course. Land Cleveland. He read it 3 times. Wells had flown for 27 years. He'd seen mechanical issues, onboard medical emergencies, airspace violations. But this was new. The instruction came not from Air Traffic Control, but from DOT Special Operations Command, the kind of communication chain that activated during bomb threats or federal enforcement actions. He glanced at First Officer Denise Liu, who raised an eyebrow. "Get us rerouted," he said. "And alert cabin crew. This ride just changed altitude." Back in 1A, Loretta received the automated confirmation ping on her phone. S3 activation confirmed. She closed the phone gently and leaned back, eyes on the clouds. She wasn't angry. She was steady. The worst kind of accountability for the arrogant was the one that didn't arrive with a yell, but with a whisper and a folder. The next time Richard passed by her row, he noticed something odd. The man across from Loretta was openly filming him. The woman in 2D stared at him like she knew something he didn't. He straightened his tie, walked faster. In the galley, Richard met eyes with Ava, a junior flight attendant on only her 5th full route. "What's going on?" she asked quietly. "Mind your business," he snapped. But Ava didn't mind her business. She opened the crew portal app. She tapped into the onboard log. She created a private entry. Observed interaction between lit attendant and passenger in seat 1A. Tone discriminatory. Physical contact occurred. Witnessed by multiple passengers. She paused. Then she clicked Send to FAA Watch Log. It was anonymous, but it was official. She'd done what she could. For now. 32,000 feet below, in Washington, D.C., Harold Meacham was looking at the same red blinking alert on his screen. He recognized the S3 code. He'd only ever seen it once before. "Loretta," he muttered. He picked up the phone. "Put jet reach on internal freeze," he told his assistant. "And tell FAA we're launching a level 1 audit of their terminals." His tone was clipped. He wasn't angry either. He was afraid. Because he knew if Loretta Sinclair was pressing S3, it wasn't just about a bad flight. It was about something bigger. And it had already begun. Richard Sloan didn't like being watched. Not by passengers. Not by his junior colleague Ava with her wide, worried eyes. And especially not by the woman in 1A, who hadn't raised her voice once, but now seemed to radiate some unseen authority. He adjusted the cuffs of his uniform shirt and picked up the silver water pitcher. He had a routine. A process. First class wasn't just about service. It was about signaling status. It was where he could pretend, even for a few hours, that he was part of the echelon he served. He began with seat 2B, a white man in his late 40s who barely looked up from his laptop. "Sparkling water with lemon," Richard offered smoothly, already placing the napkin with the airline logo carefully on the tray table. Next was 2D. "Would you like some Prosecco, ma'am? Or perhaps our fruit and cheese plate?" The woman smiled politely and accepted both. Then came 1B, across from Loretta, Brian Han. Richard hesitated. The phone in Brian's hand was still subtly angled. Recording, watching. "Just water," Brian said. "No ice." Richard poured it without a word. Then he turned, very deliberately, to seat 1A. "Here," he muttered, setting down a plastic cup with room temperature water. No lemon, no napkin, no tray, just a slosh of indifference. Loretta looked down at it, then back at him. Her voice was velvet over steel. "You've provided everyone else with a napkin and a wedge of citrus." He straightened. "We're low on lemons." She glanced at Brian's glass. Lemon wedge perched like a crown. "I see." He didn't respond. He turned away. Brian lowered his phone. "You handled that with more grace than I would have," he said softly. Loretta offered a thin smile. "Grace isn't always a gift. Sometimes it's the last tool left in the box." Back in economy, Nadine Lowe leaned into the aisle, trying to get a better view of first class. She wasn't trying to be nosy, at least not for her own sake. But when you were a black woman in America, and you saw another black woman being dismissed, disrespected, or degraded in public, you paid attention. She tapped the older man in the ball cap. "Something's going on up there," he nodded. "My gut tells me that flight attendant's about to learn who he just messed with." In the rear galley, Ava stood still, eyes fixed on the crew tablet. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She had never filed an FAA log entry before, but she had watched Richard. Watched how his eyes changed when he addressed black passengers, how his tone shifted, how his body leaned in with just a little too much dominance. She remembered her first week of training. Victoria, the senior flight lead, had told her, "Don't escalate. Don't file things you can't prove. Passengers play the race card all the time. Let it go unless they threaten violence." But what she'd seen today, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a pattern. She looked over her shoulder. No one in the galley. She tapped again. FAA watch entry confirmed. Ava exhaled. Her hands were trembling. Back in first class, Loretta was reviewing the funding matrix when the captain's voice came over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We've received updated routing instructions from air traffic control and will be making an unscheduled landing in Cleveland. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin. Richard froze mid-step. Cleveland. This flight was supposed to be non-stop to Detroit. He made his way quickly to the galley and pulled aside Ava. Did the captain say Cleveland? She nodded. Sounds like it. He furrowed his brow. Why? Ava shrugged. Could be anything. Weather? Security? But Richard's stomach dropped. He turned to look toward seat 1A. Loretta Sinclair was calmly placing her notebook back into her leather satchel. She looked entirely unbothered, which terrified him. 20 minutes later, the plane began its descent. From her window seat, Loretta could already see the flashing lights on the tarmac. 3 SUVs, 1 unmarked van, and a familiar insignia. Department of Transportation, Office of Federal Compliance. She didn't smile. She didn't smirk. She simply waited. As the plane touched down, the silence in first class thickened. Brian Hahn closed his laptop. The woman in 2D sat up straighter. Even Richard had stopped speaking to passengers altogether. Captain Wells's voice returned. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated while we await clearance. Our ground team will be boarding shortly for an important compliance matter. Richard's hands were clammy. He looked around the cabin. No one met his eyes. In economy, Nadine turned to the older man. That's not normal. Nope. You think it's because of her? I'd bet my pension. The door opened with a pressurized hiss. 3 officials boarded. 1 woman with a Department of Transportation badge, 1 man from the FAA, and a third, tall, broad-shouldered, with a soft southern drawl. Federal Compliance Team, he said. We're here to speak with the lead flight attendant and a passenger in seat 1A. Loretta stood. No fear, no hesitation. She reached into her jacket and pulled out her federal ID. Judge Loretta Sinclair, DOT Senior Policy Advisor. Richard's knees buckled slightly. The man from FAA raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, we've received notice of a protocol activation. Are you the reporting party? I am. Then we'll begin interviews as soon as the cabin is cleared. She nodded. Then she sat down. Without a word, without a fuss. Because when you carry the system inside your phone, you don't need to shout. You just wait for the doors to open. The cabin remained still. Passengers whispered. A child began to cry. Loretta opened her notebook one more time. She drew a line. Under it, she wrote, "Every seat has a number, but not every passenger has a voice. Today, I used mine." When the door to Flight 2270 opened on the Cleveland tarmac, it wasn't just the frigid gust of winter air that swept into the cabin. It was the unmistakable chill of accountability. Richard Sloane's throat went dry. He watched as 3 officials boarded in silence, clipboards in hand, expressions unreadable. The first wore a dark navy windbreaker marked Doubt Compliance Division. The second was younger, with the unmistakable badge of the Federal Aviation Administration clipped to his belt. The third, a quiet man in gray slacks and an ID that read Inspector Mark Hendricks, Office of Inspector General, scanned the cabin like a man who'd already read the report. Passengers sat still, their whispers like electrical static under the overhead lights. Captain Reuben Wells stepped into the galley to meet them, his calm pilot voice now edged with unease. "We were told to hold here. This is unusual. Mind sharing the nature of the issue?" Inspector Hendricks flipped a folder closed. "There's been a federal protocol trigger. We need to speak with crew members and select passengers. This is now an active compliance matter." Richard felt his chest tighten. This was not going to be a routine write-up. In seat 1A, Loretta Sinclair remained seated, perfectly composed. She had long ago learned that dignity wasn't just how you stood up, but when you chose to stay seated. She could feel the tension rippling through the cabin. The woman in 2D kept glancing at her, unsure whether to offer sympathy or distance. Brian Hahn across the aisle sat still, his phone still resting face down on his tray. His expression said, "I saw it, all of it." Ava, the junior flight attendant, stepped into the galley, lips pressed into a line. Her eyes caught Loretta's for a brief moment, then dropped quickly. Guilt? Fear? Maybe both. Then came the voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. Due to a compliance inspection, we are currently holding passengers on board. Please remain in your seats until further instructions are given. Thank you for your cooperation." The collective groan from the economy cabin was muted, but unmistakable. But no one moved. The FAA agent and Inspector Hendricks approached Richard near the front galley. "Name?" the agent asked. "Richard Sloan, lead attendant. You're aware of an incident involving a passenger in seat 1A. Richard hesitated. "There was a misunderstanding. The passenger attempted to use a restricted lavatory, and I redirected her to the facilities in economy. Standard procedure." The agent raised an eyebrow. "Did you place your hands on her?" Richard swallowed. "Only to guide her. Nothing aggressive." Hendricks jotted something down. "We'll be conducting interviews shortly. Please remain available." The unspoken message: don't leave the aircraft. In the economy section, Nadine Lowe watched it all unfold with quiet intensity. Her kids had texted her earlier, checking if she'd landed. She hadn't answered yet. She didn't want to tell them what she'd just seen, a black woman in first class being treated like she didn't belong. That woman didn't scream, didn't argue, didn't even raise her voice. But now the government had arrived, and the plane had landed somewhere else. It told Nadine something she hadn't let herself believe in a long time. Sometimes, when the system fails you in public, it still answers in private. One row back, Ava checked her tablet. The FAA watch log had been acknowledged. Her note, anonymous, was now part of an official investigation. She felt both terrified and strangely relieved. She'd said something, even if no one knew it was her. Inspector Hendricks approached Loretta next. "Judge Sinclair?" She looked up calmly. "Yes, I understand you were involved in an incident with a member of the crew. Would you be willing to speak privately?" Loretta gave a single nod. Brian Hahn stood as she gathered her belongings. "If it helps, I recorded what happened," he said. "Just in case you need a witness." Loretta met his gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Hahn, Brian Hahn. I appreciate your integrity, Mr. Hahn." He nodded, and she walked with the agents toward the front. The cabin didn't erupt in applause. This wasn't a movie, but people watched and remembered. The interview room inside the Cleveland terminal was small, sterile, functional. Loretta sat across from the three agents, her ID already scanned, her credentials already verified. "We understand you initiated an S3 protocol," Hendricks said. "I did. Can you walk us through what occurred?" She recounted everything, not with emotion, but with precision. The denial of beverage service, the differential treatment observed across racial lines, the request to verify her ticket despite being seated, the physical contact, the quote, "Your kind should use the back." There was a moment of silence. "Are you certain of the exact phrasing?" the FAA agent asked. "I am. I don't mishear that kind of language, not after a lifetime of hearing it." They nodded. "Do you wish to file a formal complaint?" "No," Loretta said. "I wish to document a pattern. What happens to me today is happening to others with less recourse. That's the real problem." Hendricks leaned back. "We've received a number of witness statements, including one from a crew member. There's also a passenger recording corroborating your account. This will move quickly." "Good," Loretta said. She stood. "Because I have a speech to give tomorrow, and a billion-dollar checkbook that's no longer open to jet reach." Back on the plane, passengers were finally deplaning, one row at a time. Richard was pulled aside by another compliance officer. Ava, still quiet, handed out water bottles in economy. As Loretta stepped off the jet bridge, a Skyreach executive in a blazer 2 sizes too big rushed toward her. "Judge Sinclair, on behalf of the airline, I want to deeply apologize." She raised one hand. "I'm not interested in apologies." He froze. "I'm interested in infrastructure, in systems, in whether your company treats dignity as a PR issue or a policy." And with that, she walked past him, out into the terminal, into the next phase, into the part where justice wasn't just poetic, it was funded. Have you ever witnessed someone quietly stand up against injustice and win without raising their voice? If you believe real power doesn't yell, it enacts policy, drop a comment with the word integrity. And if you're tired of people getting away with discrimination in public spaces, hit the like button. Because justice isn't always loud, but it always lands. By the time Loretta Sinclair arrived at the terminal conference room set aside for compliance interviews, the news had already spread beyond Cleveland Hopkins International. A federal judge had been pushed by a flight attendant. A plane had been rerouted. Federal investigators had boarded. And the woman in 1A, she wasn't just anyone. She was the one holding the pen over $4.2 billion. Across the terminal, Inspector Mark Hendricks briefed his team in low tones. "We have statements from at least 5 passengers. One junior flight attendant filed an anonymous FAA log before landing. We also have video from passenger 1B. Clear verbal confirmation of the remark, 'Your kind should use the back.'" Another agent whistled under his breath. Hendricks nodded grimly. "It's real, it's documented, and it's systemic." Systemic? Judge Sinclair filed a federal escalation code, S3. She didn't just want an apology, she triggered a structural audit. We're talking vendor-wide compliance freeze, the kind that halts payments to contractors and flags airport partnerships. Damn. Exactly. In another room, Richard Sloan sat across from 2 agents and a union representative. His confidence had deflated. Gone was the upright posture, the crisp tone. What remained was a man in damage control mode. "I've flown this route for years," he began. "There's never been a problem." The agent tapped a folder. "There have been 9 passenger complaints against you in the last 18 months, Mr. Sloan. All for differential treatment. Most were dismissed or resolved by your flight supervisor. Know who that supervisor was?" Richard shifted. "Victoria Weber." "Correct. And Victoria Weber is currently under review for suppression of discrimination logs." The agent leaned forward. "You ever refer to a passenger as your kind before?" "No," Richard said quickly. "That's not how I meant it." "How did you mean it?" "I meant economy passengers. Not racially." The second agent raised an eyebrow. "Passenger 1A was in first class. I thought she'd moved seats. I wasn't sure. Even if that were true, it wouldn't excuse physical contact or the tone." Richard glanced down. "I made a mistake." "No," the agent said flatly. "You revealed a pattern." Meanwhile, Ava sat in a quiet office with a compliance officer and an FAA liaison. Her voice was steady, but her palms were damp. "I didn't want to cause problems," she said, "but I saw it, and I couldn't ignore it." "You filed a log entry before landing?" "Yes, anonymously. I thought if I spoke up, I'd be blacklisted." The officer nodded. "You're protected, and your courage matters. Your testimony may confirm this wasn't an isolated incident." Ava blinked back tears. "I didn't want to take sides, but I've worked with Richard before. He's different with black passengers, and not in a good way." The FAA rep nodded. "You did the right thing. What you saw matters." She swallowed. "Then I'm not sorry." "You shouldn't be." By 4:00 p.m., the internal report had expanded from an in-flight incident to a full federal probe. DOT Secretary Harold Meacham held an emergency Zoom briefing with FAA leadership, the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, and representatives from the House Transportation Committee. Judge Sinclair's statement is damning, Meacham said. The evidence is compelling, and this isn't just about one route attendant. It's about whether JetReach has enabled a pattern of discriminatory behavior. He tapped the table. We're freezing all reimbursements to JetReach for the current quarter, effective immediately. No federal dollars move until this is resolved. A murmur rose on the call. The FAA director raised a hand. Should we notify JetReach? We already did, Meacham said. Their CEO is requesting a call. I told them Judge Sinclair doesn't take PR calls. Loretta, meanwhile, was quiet. She had returned to her hotel, where a secure laptop awaited. She logged into her DOT server and reviewed the list of contractors affected by the freeze. JetReach's name appeared next to $276 million in pending disbursements. She flagged it. Non-compliant, pending investigation. She then opened her speech draft, the one she had been preparing for the Detroit conference. She scrolled past the legal citations, past the statistics. She began typing new lines. When people ask what discrimination looks like in 2025, they expect burning crosses or slurs hurled like stones. But it's smaller than that. It's being ignored in a cabin you paid to sit in. It's being touched without consent. It's being told you don't belong. And when you're silent long enough, they forget they're wrong. Sometimes, justice doesn't arrive with a roar. It arrives with a redirected flight path. She saved the file, and she exhaled. In the JetReach executive offices, chaos was brewing. CEO Marcus Drake slammed his fist on the conference table. Who the hell is she? His chief legal officer responded, Judge Loretta Sinclair, retired federal judge, now senior advisor to DOT. She oversees infrastructure disbursement. Why the hell was she flying commercial? She flies commercial deliberately. Accessibility statement, transparency. So this is political? It's personal, and it's factual. We have footage. We have multiple witnesses. One of our own staff corroborated. Damage control, now. It's not about damage control, Marcus, the CLO said. It's about damage done. Back in Cleveland, Loretta received a text message. It was from Brian Hahn. Ms. Sinclair, if you ever need me to testify, count me in. What happened wasn't just wrong, it was systemic, she replied. Thank you, Mr. Hahn. It's people like you that make the system work. And in a separate thread, a message from Ava arrived. Anonymous, unsigned, but unmistakably heartfelt. I was scared to say something, but I did. Because you did, Loretta smiled. Then you were never the only one, and you won't be the last. Back in Washington, reporters were already circling the story. The headlines would be brutal, but the truth? It was already in motion. Loretta didn't need the world to praise her. She needed them to remember that someone in 1A didn't yell. She simply moved the system, and it listened. The morning after Flight 2270 made headlines, the executive suite of JetReach Airlines turned from glass and chrome to war room. The stock price had dropped 4.7% in pre-market trading. The FAA and DOT had both issued statements confirming an active investigation. But what alarmed CEO Marcus Drake most wasn't the media pressure or the looming fines. It was a single line in an internal memo from the Department of Transportation. All federal reimbursements to JetReach have been frozen pending review. A total of $422 million, locked. Drake threw the paper onto the table. She can't just do that. She doesn't have the authority to. She does, said Jennifer Lang, the company's VP of Regulatory Affairs. Under the Sinclair Protocol, federal transportation advisors can activate emergency compliance audits that trigger an automatic funding freeze. Drake paced. So, one woman, because a flight attendant was rude to her, can tank our quarter? Lang didn't look up. She wasn't just rude to her. He put his hands on a federal judge. There's video. There are witnesses. And she's the woman who wrote the very policy you're complaining about. Drake sat down hard. Then we make it about optics. Apologize. Settle. Pledge some new training. It's too late for optics, Lang said quietly. In a conference room at the Cleveland FAA field office, the investigation deepened. Inspector Mark Hendricks and his team reviewed statements from passengers, internal employee records, past complaints, and flight crew performance logs. The picture became painfully clear. 9 prior complaints naming Richard Sloan, 3 additional filed under the same supervisor, all closed without escalation. An anonymous log from Ava, now verified. Multiple passenger videos, including one already leaked online. And then there was the kicker. A time-stamped message from Loretta Sinclair to DIOT Command. Activate Protocol S3. Immediate review. Hold jet reach allocations. Never seen someone pull that trigger before, one agent murmured. She didn't pull it, Hendricks corrected. She designed it. At her hotel, Loretta sat by the window with a cup of coffee in hand. She watched the gray Ohio skyline fade into blue. Her phone buzzed. A text from Harold Meacham, DIOT Secretary. HQ received your documentation. FAA opened parallel inquiry. Funding freeze formalized. Will notify House Oversight. Another buzz. A news alert. Breaking. JetReach loses federal funding access amid discrimination scandal. Loretta closed her eyes briefly. Not with exhaustion, but with affirmation. This was never about revenge. It was about pressure points and making sure the system felt it. Nadine Lowe, now back in Detroit, sat in her kitchen with the TV on in the background. Her teenage daughter walked in, pouring cereal, eyes barely on the screen. But when she saw the headline, she froze. Wasn't that your flight? Nadine nodded slowly. You were on the plane with that judge? Nadine smiled. I was. She sat in 1A. Her daughter sat beside her. What happened? Nadine took a breath. She didn't yell. She didn't push back. She just looked at him like she'd seen it before, like she expected better. Then what? She made a call, and the whole damn system moved. Back at JetReach HQ, the legal team scrambled. The board demanded an emergency meeting. One investor threatened to pull out unless a full public accounting was given. Drake considered resigning. Then he reconsidered. They'd have to fire Sloan, of course. Probably Victoria Weber, too. But Loretta Sinclair wouldn't be placated with sacrificial lambs. She wanted systems, structures, and the truth. In the FAA compliance office, Ava sat in a closed-door meeting with an ethics officer. She was scared, but not quiet. I joined this airline because I believed in service, she said. But I've watched crew members decide who gets treated like they belong and who gets treated like a problem. Did you witness that behavior with Mr. Sloan directly? Yes, more than once. And I didn't say anything. Until now. Why now? Because Judge Sinclair didn't scream, and that made it louder. The ethics officer paused. You're aware you may be called to testify? Ava nodded. I'm ready. Loretta spent the afternoon in consultation with DIOT counsel. They reviewed the terms of JetReach's operating licenses, their diversity and anti-discrimination filings, and the last 3 quarters of passenger complaint summaries. They cross-referenced everything. The result? A 47-page compliance failure report. It would be sent to every major airport authority in the country. JetReach's reputation wasn't just bruised, it was bleeding. That evening, Loretta took a quiet call from Brian Hahn. I wanted to say thank you, he said, for not letting it slide. She was silent a moment. Do you know how many times I've let it slide, Mr. Hahn? She asked, gently. He didn't answer. Too many. That's why this one mattered. That night, Loretta emailed her speech to the Detroit conference organizers. She added a new final line. When dignity becomes optional, justice must become mandatory. She pressed send. Then she went to bed. Tomorrow, she'd speak not as a victim, but as a reformer. Because justice didn't just land the plane. It redirected the flight path of an entire industry. Loretta Sinclair didn't expect the knock. It came at 7:14 a.m., soft but firm. She had just finished buttoning her blouse when she opened the door of her hotel suite. A young man in a crisp Diot jacket stood there, holding a manila envelope. "Judge Sinclair, Director Meacham asked me to deliver this personally. Judge Sinclair, Director Meacham asked me to deliver this personally." She thanked him, closed the door, and sat down in the armchair by the window. The sun over Cleveland was cold and pale. She opened the envelope. Inside was a printed brief. Subject: Jet Reach Internal Audit Preliminary Findings. Multiple unfiled passenger complaints. Failure to forward racial discrimination reports to HR. Supervisor interference. And a pattern of internal suppression dating back 22 months. Recommendation: terminate all relevant staff. Suspend federal contracts. Refer to DOJ for civil rights investigation. She stared at the final sentence. The culture of tolerance ends here. In Washington, Secretary Meacham stood at the podium before a press corps ready to pounce. "This is not about one flight or one crew member," he said. "It's about a pattern. It's about accountability. And it's about rebuilding public trust in aviation." A reporter raised a hand. "Will the department be pursuing criminal charges?" "That decision lies with the Department of Justice," Meacham replied. "But we're referring this for civil rights inquiry. We believe the evidence warrants it." Another voice. "What role did Judge Sinclair play in this?" Meacham's tone shifted from official to unmistakably proud. "She did what leaders are supposed to do. She didn't call the press, she called the process. She trusted the system she helped build, and she proved it still works." Back at Jet Reach, panic turned to paralysis. In a meeting with senior staff, CEO Marcus Drake slammed the final audit page on the table. "We're cooked." No one disagreed. Victoria Weber, the flight supervisor under scrutiny, sat quietly in the corner. Her face was drained of color. "We need to offer resignations, immediately," Lang said. "If we don't, they'll rip our licenses from underneath us." Drake looked around the room. "Richard Sloan? Gone. Officially terminated. Weber?" Lang turned. "Victoria, you have 30 seconds to speak." Victoria looked up slowly. "I didn't tell him to say what he said." "No, but you buried 9 complaints," Lang snapped. "You covered for him and for others. You treated accountability like a threat instead of a tool." Drake stood. "You're done. Effective immediately. We'll walk you out by noon." Victoria didn't argue. She simply picked up her coat and left. At the Detroit airport, conference day was in full swing. Screens in the lobby displayed Loretta Sinclair's name beside the phrase, "Keynote Speaker, Aviation Equity and Ethics." As she stepped onto the stage, there was no dramatic music, no spotlight, just quiet attention. She adjusted the mic and began. "Good morning. Yesterday I flew here through Cleveland, not by choice. The flight I boarded changed direction because something happened at 36,000 feet. Not turbulence, not weather, but something more familiar, more predictable. Something many of us know by name but often refuse to acknowledge out loud: systemic bias." She paused. "In a cabin that cost the same for every seat, I was told I didn't belong. Not with words alone, but with actions. And then I was touched, pushed, directed to the back, as if my body didn't belong where my ticket said it did." Murmurs in the crowd. She raised a hand. "I didn't shout. I didn't demand. I didn't even explain. I made a call, and the system answered." She let it settle. "Not because I'm important, but because I am prepared. Because I documented. Because I trusted that the policies we wrote were not suggestions, but standards." She clicked the remote. A slide appeared. Sinclair Protocol Compliance Model. "We need systems that don't rely on loudness to detect injustice. Systems that work on logs, on patterns, on escalation triggers. We don't need heroes, we need process." She closed with a single line. "Power is not the ability to punish. It's the ability to reform." The room stood, not out of ceremony, but out of clarity. Meanwhile, in a coffee shop near the Jet Reach hub in Atlanta, Ava watched a live stream of the speech on her phone. She sat alone, but not unnoticed. A stranger at the next table glanced over. "You fly with them?" Ava hesitated. "Used to." The woman looked at the screen. "Hell of a thing she did." Ava nodded. "Yeah, she made us all look harder at what we tolerate." At DOAT headquarters, Secretary Meacham drafted a memo. 2. All FAA certified carriers subject mandatory protocol. Integration. Effective immediately. All commercial aviation entities must integrate Sinclair protocol within 60 days. Failure to comply will result in funding disqualification. All internal crew discrimination reports must be logged, escalated, and disclosed. Anonymous FAA watch access will be audited quarterly. He hit send. And the ripple began. In her hotel suite that night, Loretta removed her earrings and placed them gently on the nightstand. She thought of her father, how he used to sit on the porch in his Air Force jacket, even when no one saluted. She thought of all the times she'd been dismissed, looked past, patronized, and how none of them had ever stopped her. Because the most dangerous person in any room was the one who could smile through insult and still hold the pen. She reached for her notebook, wrote a single sentence. "There's blood in the system, but now the system's bleeding out the poison." She closed it, turned off the light, and slept. Tomorrow, she'd write new standards, and the industry would follow. By Monday morning, the phrase Sinclair Protocol had been mentioned in over 7,000 articles. Business journals, civil rights blogs, cable news programs, all converged on the same story. A federal judge, humiliated on a flight, had triggered a nationwide policy overhaul in under 72 hours. Loretta Sinclair, however, wasn't reading the headlines. She was sitting across from the FAA's General Counsel in a secured meeting room at DOAT headquarters in DC. The windows were frosted for privacy. The conference table was steel and matte black. Her notebook lay open next to a warm mug of black coffee. "I appreciate you coming in person, Judge Sinclair," the counsel began. "We've completed the Phase 1 reviews, and frankly, it's worse than we thought." Loretta didn't blink. "How bad?" He tapped a tablet, scrolling. 38 internal reports suppressed across 5 carriers. 17 involved crew behavior toward passengers of color. 9 involved repeat offenders who were still flying routes as of last week. She set her mug down. "How many had documentation?" "All of them." "Escalated?" He hesitated. "None." Loretta leaned back in her chair. "There's blood in the docket," she said, "and we've been stamping it with signatures." Elsewhere in the building, Ava stood outside a small interview room. She had been summoned to give additional testimony to the Joint Oversight Subcommittee. Her palms were damp. Her blazer, borrowed, felt too formal, too tight. A staffer opened the door. "Ms. Jackson?" She stepped inside. 2 lawmakers, 1 staff attorney, a stenographer, and a placard that read, "Congressional Review Panel, Aviation Civil Rights Subcommittee." Ava sat. "Ms. Jackson, thank you for being here today," the lead counsel said. "Please describe in your own words what prompted you to file an anonymous FAA log." She took a breath. It wasn't one moment. It was all the little moments. The tray slammed harder. The looks. The way passengers of color were treated like paperwork errors. And the fear of saying something. "Because if I did, I might not fly again." "Why did this flight make you speak up?" "Because the woman in seat 1A didn't need to yell. And yet, everything moved." In the meantime, Loretta finalized a draft letter to the National Airport Operators Council. It outlined the new expectations under the Sinclair Protocol. Quarterly training audits, public-facing reporting dashboards, anonymous whistleblower funding protections, suspension guidelines for discriminatory crew behavior, federal funding contingencies tied to compliance. She signed it, not with flourish, but with finality. At Jet Reach HQ, the fallout was accelerating. Marcus Drake had tendered his resignation under mounting board pressure. Victoria Weber, now formally under investigation by the Office of Professional Accountability, had been subpoenaed to appear in court for obstruction of compliance. Jet reaches Chief Diversity Officer, a position created for optics and rarely consulted, resigned live on LinkedIn with a 4-page open letter. We can't hide behind performative policies anymore. If we don't listen to our crew, to our passengers, especially the ones who don't yell, we deserve to lose public trust. Later that day, Loretta visited the Department of Justice. She met with the Deputy Assistant Attorney General in a closed session. "Judge Sinclair," the woman said, "we've seen civil rights cases over airport security, customs detainment, but never one that originated inside the cabin." "This one did," Loretta replied. "And every day we pretend it doesn't exist, the cabin gets quieter and colder for the people who experience it." The Deputy AG nodded. "We're opening a formal review, Title VI grounds. We'll use the Sinclair audit as our foundation." "Good. It's time aviation became accountable to the public, not just shareholders." That evening, Loretta took a quiet walk around the National Mall. The Lincoln Memorial glowed in the distance. She remembered being 16, holding her father's hand, staring up at that statue, and not fully understanding why he wept. She understood now. Because sometimes, the work isn't about what changes tomorrow. It's about making sure someone else won't be touched, questioned, or directed to the back, just because of who they are. She stood for a while, letting the wind catch the ends of her coat. Then she turned back toward the Capitol, toward the next docket. What would you do if someone quietly changed the rules for everyone, just by standing their ground? Drop a comment with, "Real power is quiet." If you believe justice doesn't always need to shout to be heard, share this story with someone who needs to know how one calm act can shake a system. Because sometimes, the most powerful sentence is the one written into policy. And sometimes, the most powerful seat on the plane is the one that doesn't move. By the end of the week, the weight of the federal government had fully landed on Jet Reach. Congressional hearings had been scheduled. FAA subpoenas were flying faster than commercial departures. The Department of Justice had officially opened a civil rights probe into systemic discrimination in the airline's operations. And yet, the woman who started it all, Judge Loretta Sinclair, remained a step ahead of every headline. In a secure DOT strategy room, she stood before a board displaying flight routes, funding flows, and complaint data. "Let's talk consequences," she said. "Because until the industry feels pressure, nothing changes." Harold Meacham nodded. "We've frozen over $430 million in grants, public-private infrastructure projects, tech upgrades, fleet replacements, but the backlash is coming." "We can't afford to blink," Loretta said. "Not now. Their betting will soften when it becomes uncomfortable, but the public's watching." A young policy analyst stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're tracking protest activity. Some crew unions are claiming unfair treatment, saying this is targeting individuals, not systems." Loretta looked him dead in the eye. "That's because individuals built the system, and they're scared we've finally noticed." In the Capitol, Representative Janine Rowe took to the House floor. "This is not about one airline. This is about an industry that's long operated without transparency or accountability." Judge Sinclair's experience wasn't unique. What was unique was her ability to document it and trigger a response. But make no mistake, there are thousands of flyers who endure the same humiliation without recourse. C-SPAN cut to a live feed as Senator Howard Clay, chair of the Senate Aviation Oversight Committee, called for a bipartisan review of airline discrimination reporting. "This is bigger than bias," he said. "This is about regulatory cowardice, agencies that refuse to act unless they're embarrassed into it." In Detroit, Loretta stepped off the train and walked alone to a small community center on the east side. She had been invited, quietly, to meet with local activists who had been documenting transportation inequities for years. The room was modest. Folding chairs, no cameras, no reporters. A middle-aged woman named Claudine offered her a cup of coffee. "Didn't think you'd actually show." Loretta smiled. "I always show up where the real work is." A young man leaned forward. "What's the plan, Judge? You got Washington's attention, but when this cools down, they'll go back to business as usual." "No, they won't," Loretta said. "Because this time, we're not just documenting pain. We're rewriting policy." She handed them printed packets. draft guidelines for community-based reporting pathways, embedded in the FAA's pilot programs for regional airports. "If they won't listen to travelers," she said, "we'll make them listen to data." Back in DC, Ava walked the marble halls of the Russell Senate office building. She wasn't alone. She had been asked to join a panel of whistleblowers testifying about crew-level suppression of discrimination reports. Her statement, now reviewed and vetted, had been distributed to the press. "I didn't speak up to ruin careers. I spoke up because silence was making us complicit. I love flying, I love serving, but I don't love watching people be treated as less than and being told that's just how the cabin works." In a quiet moment before she entered the hearing chamber, Loretta appeared beside her. "You ready?" Ava swallowed hard. "I'm scared." "Good," Loretta said. "That means you're not numb." Then she added, "Courage doesn't mean comfort. It means conscience." The hearing was broadcast live. Ava spoke with poise, her voice steady even when her hands weren't. She answered every question. She named names. She described moments that had lived in her chest like lead. Senator Clay leaned forward. "Do you believe this is isolated to jet reach?" "No, sir. I believe it's endemic. How many flight attendants like you are watching this right now?" Ava blinked. "Too many, waiting to see if I get punished or protected." The next morning, Loretta met with the Joint Task Force on Transportation Equity. The room was tense. Corporate reps from multiple airlines had been invited. Some refused to show. Others sent lawyers. But one woman, Evelyn Rocha, COO of a major regional carrier, sat across from Loretta. "Your protocol scares my board," Evelyn admitted. "What would you do if someone quietly changed the rules for everyone, just by standing their ground?" Drop a comment with, "Real power is quiet." If you believe justice doesn't always need to shout to be heard, share this story with someone who needs to know how one calm act can shake a system. Because sometimes, the most powerful sentence is the one written into policy. And sometimes, the most powerful seat on the plane is the one that doesn't move. By the end of the week, the weight of the federal government had fully landed on jet reach. Congressional hearings had been scheduled. FAA subpoenas were flying faster than commercial departures. The Department of Justice had officially opened a civil rights probe into systemic discrimination in the airline's operations. And yet, the woman who started it all, Judge Loretta Sinclair, remained a step ahead of every headline. In a secure DOT strategy room, she stood before a board displaying flight routes, funding flows, and complaint data. "Let's talk consequences," she said. "Because until the industry feels pressure, nothing changes." Harold Meacham nodded. "We've frozen over $430 million in grants, public-private infrastructure projects, tech upgrades, fleet replacements, but the backlash is coming." "We can't afford to blink," Loretta said. "Not now. Their betting will soften when it becomes uncomfortable, but the public's watching." A young policy analyst stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're tracking protest activity. Some crew unions are claiming unfair treatment, saying this is targeting individuals, not systems." Loretta looked him dead in the eye. "That's because individuals built the system, and they're scared we've finally noticed." In the Capitol, Representative Jeanine Rowe took to the House floor. "This is not about one airline. This is about an industry that's long operated without transparency or accountability." Judge Sinclair's experience wasn't unique. What was unique was her ability to document it and trigger a response. But make no mistake, there are thousands of flyers who endure the same humiliation without recourse. C-SPAN cut to a live feed as Senator Howard Clay, chair of the Senate Aviation Oversight Committee, called for a bipartisan review of airline discrimination reporting. "This is bigger than bias," he said. "This is about regulatory cowardice. Agencies that refuse to act unless they're embarrassed into it." In Detroit, Loretta stepped off the train and walked alone to a small community center on the east side. She had been invited, quietly, to meet with local activists who had been documenting transportation inequities for years. The room was modest. Folding chairs, no cameras, no reporters. A middle-aged woman named Claudine offered her a cup of coffee. "Didn't think you'd actually show." Loretta smiled. "I always show up where the real work is." A young man leaned forward. What's the plan, Judge? You got Washington's attention, but when this cools down, they'll go back to business as usual. No, they won't, Loretta said, because this time, we're not just documenting pain, we're rewriting policy. She handed them printed packets, draft guidelines for community-based reporting pathways, embedded in the FAA's pilot programs for regional airports. If they won't listen to travelers, she said, we'll make them listen to data. Back in D.C., Ava walked the marble halls of the Russell Senate office building. She wasn't alone. She had been asked to join a panel of whistleblowers testifying about crew-level suppression of discrimination reports. Her statement, now reviewed and vetted, had been distributed to the press. I didn't speak up to ruin careers. I spoke up because silence was making us complicit. I love flying, I love serving, but I don't love watching people be treated as less than and being told that's just how the cabin works. In a quiet moment before she entered the hearing chamber, Loretta appeared beside her. You ready? Ava swallowed hard. I'm scared. Good, Loretta said. That means you're not numb. Then she added, courage doesn't mean comfort. It means conscience. The hearing was broadcast live. Ava spoke with poise, her voice steady even when her hands weren't. She answered every question. She named names. She described moments that had lived in her chest like lead. Senator Clay leaned forward. Do you believe this is isolated to jet reach? No, sir. I believe it's endemic. How many flight attendants like you are watching this right now? Ava blinked. Too many, waiting to see if I get punished or protected. The next morning, Loretta met with the Joint Task Force on Transportation Equity. The room was tense. Corporate reps from multiple airlines had been invited. Some refused to show. Others sent lawyers. But one woman, Evelyn Rocha, COO of a major regional carrier, sat across from Loretta. Your protocol scares my board, Evelyn admitted. It should, Loretta replied. But not because of what it punishes, because of what it demands, honesty. What do you want from us? Truth, compliance, and to stop pretending discrimination is an accident. Outside the FAA headquarters, reporters gathered for what had now become a daily scene. Loretta had declined most interviews, but today she stepped to the mic. No passenger should need a title to be treated with dignity, she said. And no crew member should have to risk their job to defend that dignity. We are not interested in press cycles. We are interested in permanent reform. Then she turned and walked back inside. At home that night, Loretta sat with an unopened envelope from the office of the White House liaison. She hadn't asked for recognition, but inside was a handwritten note. Thank you for restoring faith in the system you helped build. This country needs more stewards and fewer stars. POTUS. She placed the card in her drawer, not because she needed validation, but because it reminded her, systems don't change when power speaks. They change when power listens. And this time, it had. The pressure was on, and it wasn't coming from below. It was coming from the top. Loretta Sinclair didn't want a statue. She didn't want a round of applause or a Senate resolution or a photo op at the White House. Those things came and went like the tides. What she wanted, what she had always wanted, was for the next black woman who boarded a plane to be left alone. No scrutiny, no second guessing, no hands on her shoulders guiding her where she didn't need to go, just a seat, paid for, reserved, respected. On Wednesday morning, she returned to the one place no one expected her to go. The airport. She arrived alone, with a roller bag and a scarf wrapped tight against the wind. Her itinerary was short. Washington to Atlanta, to meet with a coalition of regional airport compliance officers. The booking had been made under her usual name. No aliases, no security flags. The carrier, not JetReach, but one of their competitors. Still, as she stood in line for TSA, Loretta could feel the buzz building. A young agent whispered to his colleague, "That's her, right? Seat 1A?" The colleague nodded. Loretta didn't acknowledge them. She just waited. She didn't cut the line, didn't flash her badge. She just moved forward, like everyone else. At the gate, a flight attendant named Miriam scanned boarding passes. When Loretta approached, Miriam paused. "Judge Sinclair," she said softly. "It's an honor." Loretta smiled faintly. "Thank you, but it's just Ms. Sinclair today." Miriam nodded, eyes bright. "Still, thank you for what you've done. My niece is training to be a flight attendant next month, and she finally believes there's a place for her in this sky." Loretta said nothing, but she reached out and gently touched Miriam's hand. In the cockpit, Captain Raiden Lee reviewed the manifest. He saw the name. He knew the story. Before the flight, he spoke briefly to the crew. "We have a VIP on board today," he said. "Not because she's famous, but because she's fair. Let's make sure today the cabin reflects the values we say we believe in." No one objected. They just nodded. Because some reputations travel ahead of you. And this one had wings. Loretta took her seat in 1A. No one questioned her. No one hovered over her boarding pass. A cup of water arrived with lemon, ice, and a napkin folded just so. She opened her leather notebook and jotted one line. "No policy is effective until it arrives in practice." The cabin door closed, and the flight took off. In Atlanta, she met with the Airport Equity Task Force, a collection of compliance directors, civil rights monitors, and union liaisons from 14 regional hubs. The room wasn't flashy. No banners, no cameras. But what it lacked in spectacle, it made up for in clarity. "Let's cut through it," Loretta said. "You've seen the protocols. You've read the audit summaries. What's broken?" The man from Memphis raised a hand. "Internal complaint reports are routed through supervisors who often know the offenders. That's where it dies." The woman from Tulsa nodded. "Passengers don't know where to go, and crew don't trust the system to protect them." Loretta leaned forward. "Then we fix that. We design around fear, not through it." She unveiled a draft tool, a digital platform allowing real-time, anonymous reporting for both passengers and crew, verified through independent third-party review. No internal suppression, no buried emails, just data, transparent, auditable, actionable. The room fell silent, until someone clapped, then another, and then they all did. Not for her, but for the fact that it was possible. That afternoon, a reporter caught up with Loretta outside the terminal. "Judge Sinclair, how does it feel to fly again after everything that's happened?" She paused, then answered, "It feels the same and different. Same seat, same air. But this time, the system followed me on board." That night in her hotel, Loretta received a message from a high school debate team in South Carolina. It read, "We quoted you in our regional final. The part where you said, 'Courage doesn't mean comfort, it means conscience.' We won. Thank you for showing us how to speak without shouting." Loretta replied simply, "Then you've already learned the most important rule. Lead seated, speak when it counts, and never let them move you without reason." In the weeks that followed, the air seemed different. Not thinner, not warmer, but watched. The industry was watching itself. It began with memos, then videos, then mandatory training sessions that no longer felt like corporate theater. And behind all of it, without fanfare or self-congratulation, stood a woman who had taken a seat, held her silence, and moved a system. Loretta Sinclair. By late February, the Sinclair Protocol had been adopted by 7 major U.S. carriers and over 120 regional airports. The changes weren't sweeping in appearance. No new logos, no shiny commercials. But internally, the foundation had shifted. Complaint review panels were now staffed with third-party observers. Crew members received monthly bias training, including real-case video reenactments. Ava, now promoted to a compliance liaison for crew experience, helped design them. She walked past mirrors and didn't flinch anymore. Jet Reach Airlines, meanwhile, was in free fall. Class action lawsuits had stacked up. Former employees, emboldened by Ava's testimony, and Loretta's silence began coming forward. Flight attendants, ground crew, even contractors. One by one, they described a culture of look-away management and racial double standards. At one press conference, a former Jet Reach dispatcher said, "We weren't told to discriminate, but we knew who'd get a second chance and who'd get flagged." The DOJ subpoenaed internal communication logs. What they found wasn't overt racism. It was worse. It was habit, embedded, in tone, in shrug, in silence. Loretta watched it all unfold with the quiet precision of someone who'd long known the truth. She wasn't smug. She was strategic. Her days were filled with policy review meetings, her evenings with town halls and stakeholder calls. In Baltimore, she spoke to a room of aviation union reps. "The question isn't whether your crews are biased," she said. "It's whether your systems are biased enough to stop them." In Chicago, she met with legal scholars about embedding transport equity into civil rights law. She brought examples. Ticket disputes that escalated for black passengers, but not white ones. "Travel isn't leisure for everyone," she said. "For some, it's an obstacle course wrapped in a seatbelt." They nodded. They knew. Ava, now often invited to speak on equity panels, sometimes froze when people praised her courage. She didn't feel brave. She felt awake. In one session, a younger flight attendant approached her after the talk. "I wanted to quit last year," she said. "I thought the problem was me, but you helped me realize it was the silence." Ava smiled, then handed her a card. On the back, it read, "Silence is where bias rests. Speak, and you shift the weight." At the DOT, Loretta was preparing something larger, something permanent. A federal civil aviation equity charter. It would mandate independent passenger ombudsman at every major hub, real-time incident dashboards for public visibility, whistleblower protection funds for crew industry-wide equity audits. Every 2 years, the charter would be her legacy. Not a statue, not a name on a building, but a framework that outlived her. Then, one Tuesday morning, her phone buzzed. A new number. She picked up. A voice on the line said, "Judge Sinclair, this is Acting Administrator Rowland from the FAA. The President would like to meet with you, in private." She was silent. Then, "When?" "Tomorrow, White House West Wing, 10:15. She arrived in a dark suit, no aides, no entourage. A Marine opened the door. Inside, in a quiet side office, the President stood and extended a hand. "Judge Sinclair," he said, "thank you for saving us from ourselves." Loretta didn't smile. She simply said, "Let's not waste it." They spoke for 40 minutes, about policy, about equity, about power that doesn't need to be loud to be felt. At the end, the President asked, "What do you want?" "Not for you, for the country." She replied, "I want the most vulnerable traveler to board a plane and be treated like they own the airline." That night, she stood again at the Lincoln Memorial, not for ceremony, just to breathe. She closed her eyes and thought of her father's voice. Dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't beg. It walks in like it paid for the room. She opened her notebook, wrote, "The echo of accountability is not noise, it's resonance." And it stays. She closed the notebook and walked forward into the quiet, because the work wasn't done, but it had begun. The final week of March brought with it something Loretta Sinclair had rarely seen in all her years on the bench, in policy or in transit. Compliance, not compliance out of fear, but the kind born from recognition, from embarrassment that became understanding, from policy that finally had teeth. It began with the numbers. Over 62% of major U.S. carriers had implemented full Sinclair protocol integration. 12 regional carriers had signed a joint pledge affirming the federal equity charter. 39 airports had launched anonymous reporting systems. And, for the first time in aviation history, 4 flight attendants received federal whistleblower protection. One of them was Ava. She now sat across from Loretta in a small office inside the DOT's newly formed Division of Passenger Equity. Chit, Loretta said, notepad open. You ready for this next step? Ava exhaled. Define ready. You'll be designing crew equity metrics for annual reviews, supervisory accountability protocols. You'll help audit the very system that tried to swallow you. Ava smiled, thin but real. Then yeah, I'm ready. Loretta's calendar was now full of meetings she hadn't initiated, with people who once ghosted her memos. CEOs, labor union presidents, airport directors. They all wanted guidance. Not because she demanded it, but because she'd proven the alternative. In New York, the head of a major airline sat across from her in a soundproof boardroom. You wrecked us, he said. Public trust, internal morale, everything. Loretta folded her hands. No, she said. You wrecked yourself. I just held up a mirror. At the FAA, the newly required equity dashboard launched in beta. Each carrier's complaint data would now be public. Crew discipline metrics, passenger satisfaction gaps across demographic groups. At the top of the homepage, a quote from Loretta Sinclair. Transparency isn't punishment, it's prevention. The president formally signed the Civil Aviation Equity Charter on a Thursday morning. Loretta wasn't there. She didn't want to be. She spent that morning at a small community law clinic in Richmond, Virginia, speaking with law students about systemic repair. One of them asked, "How do you stay calm in the face of insult?" She said, "I don't stay calm. I stay collected. Calm is what you show. Collected is what you bring with you." That night, she received a message from Thomas Keller, the tech CEO who had recorded the original incident. We're building a bias detection API for crew scheduling systems. If algorithms can optimize fuel, they can flag risk. Want to help us train the model? She replied, only if you agree bias doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it sits in first class. He responded, understood. Let's build something that doesn't blink. Across the country, social media was awash with #Seat1A stories. People shared moments of subtle bias, of recovery, of confrontation without escalation. A young black girl posted a photo from her first solo flight. He asked if I was lost. I showed him my ticket. Then I sat in 1A and smiled the whole way. Thank you, Judge Sinclair. Loretta saw it and saved it. Not for her own pride, but because it was working. The shift, the seat. At the White House, a junior staffer drafted a proposal to name a federal equity initiative after her. Loretta declined. She wrote back, name it after the girl who flew solo. She's who we did this for. In Atlanta, a JetReach board member held a press conference. We failed, he said. Not just a judge, not just our crew, but every flyer who watched how we responded and saw nothing. The airline announced a 5-year restructuring, independent audits, and a $75 million reparative investment in equitable travel initiatives. They didn't ask Loretta to endorse it. She wouldn't have anyway. But the change, she'd take it. In the quiet of her home, Loretta reflected on the last 3 months. It started with a seat, a push, a phrase. Your kind should use the back. And it ended with a signature, but not hers. The country had signed on, not perfectly, not universally, but deliberately. She opened her notebook one last time, wrote, the seat was mine, but the weight was everyone's. Now we carry it together. She closed the book, turned out the light, and let the system run. Have you ever felt powerless in a system built to ignore people like you? If you believe justice doesn't begin with anger, but with action, drop a comment with, it starts with the seat. And if you've ever held your dignity in silence like Loretta, share this story with someone who needs to believe the system can still bend, because maybe this time, it already has.